President Paul Kagame have taken this very controversial step that he knew somehow very unpopular, but maybe good economically for his country, if Donald Trump had not been in power. Because this happened just after Trump. No rules anymore.
Welcome back to Born Free. My name's Kumalo. Today I'm here with Otsile Nkadimeng, my co-host. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm good. And today we're speaking to Liesl Louw-Vaudran. How are you feeling today?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Today we're speaking about the conflict within the DRC. We're speaking about the DRC as a whole because I think it's interesting how this has been framed as a singular conflict, but it has quite an extensive amount of history. I want to start particularly where South Africans first got involved at the onset of January this year when we heard of the 14 soldiers who were killed. For many South Africans, that was an eye-opening moment because it was the first time that we recognized we were in the DRC. But secondly, it was the first time that we recognized there was an increase in conflict and that the peace that we were meant to be stabilizing within the nation wasn't necessarily being implemented. Looking from that and looking from the fact that we've withdrawn, looking at the fact that South Africa has been kind of split about the approach to the DRC, what do we make of why we were there initially? What was our intent there? And why was the 14 soldiers the breaking point for South Africa in particular?
Yes, well, our involvement in the DRC goes back to the early 2000s, actually. Former President Thabo Mbeki, then at the time, mediated a peace deal. And, we look at the conflict today and it seems really devastating. But in the late 1990s, we had almost the same situation where you had foreign troops in the DRC. And so South Africa mediated then a deal which would see foreign troops, returning home from across the continent. Actually, there were Zimbabwean soldiers, there were soldiers from Rwanda and elsewhere. So that was a lengthy process. So we actually have, since that time, been invested in trying to get a stable DRC, because obviously that is crucial for the whole continent. We know, the Eastern DRC is one of the richest parts of the continent, very, very rich in minerals, which have become more and more crucial. So, but also, at the time, it was South Africa's commitment to peacemaking. And it was one of the biggest successes because in 2006, we saw the first democratic elections in the DRC that South Africa sent, hundreds of observers, politicians. I used to, at the time I was a journalist working for Media 24. And so I used to travel to Goma, to Kinshasa a lot at that time. So then basically, so much has happened since then. But this latest deployment started at the end of 2023 when there was a resurgence of this M23 group. They actually redeployed sort of in 2021. So South Africa then went back in and deployed these 2,000 troops together with Malawi and Tanzania. So it was a SADC mission, not just a South African mission. But we also have troops in MONUSCO, in the UN. That dates back to 2012, 2013. So that's the history of why we were there. And then obviously, what we can talk about, the disastrous attack then in February.
Yeah.
Late January, actually.
When you look at how this conflict particularly is developed, but also how it's been spoken about, it seems like it's a bit hard to piece together exactly who's responsible for what. And I don't necessarily always know that to be the case of an issue of journalistic integrity or of the fact that it's just a very heated conflict. We have different actors in the AU, we have SADC, we have a lot of these different entities trying to work out different solutions. And this has been attested at potentially contributing quite significantly to the problem. Because with each group, then there's different factions, there's different influence that everyone's looking for, and there isn't necessarily the sense of collaboration that exists. One of the things that was very interesting was that South Africa and Rwanda came to a head because of the rumors that the M23 could be Rwandan backed. I want to look particularly at what that relationship has been like, and particularly at what Paul Kagame's statements were around that particular time, because he said that it was rather self-interested and that we weren't necessarily there for peacekeeping. There's a large mention for minerals and the resources that exist there that both are beneficial to South Africa and to Rwanda. So there's quite a large amount of incentives from an economic standpoint and from a trade standpoint for both of these countries. And it was interesting to see that both of them kind of took at each other instead of promoting the thing of peace that they wanted to speak about. So firstly, to the M23, I just want to ask, what do we know about the Rwandan connection? Because there is, of course, the cultural connection and the fact that they represent the same political tribe. And there's a lot of agreement there and alignment there. But there isn't necessarily the recognition. The Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, says that actually M23 is purely DRC, purely Congolese, and South Africa has then said, actually, no, there is Rwandan ties. And there's a question into whether or not Rwandan forces are on the ground. So just on that basis, then, what do we make of that?
Yes, I mean, you've said a lot of complex things, which, to unpack, but just on that question, what we refer to as the Rwandan-backed M23, I think has now become common knowledge, because way back in 2022, actually, the UN group of experts on the DRC released a report saying that there were up to 4,000 Rwandan troops in eastern DRC. Now that Rwanda denied vehemently. Eyewitness reports said the same thing, because it is very contentious. And Rwanda's reputation as a peacemaker hinges on, this question really, whether it is stoking war in Eastern DRC or occupying the Eastern DRC. But then I think the very last interview we saw with President Paul Kagame, he was asked this question and he didn't deny it. He says that Rwanda is protecting its own territorial integrity and, it's being threatened by groups in Eastern DRC. That's how he sees it. The images we've seen are, so I work for the International Crisis Group. We have, analysts in Goma and around. So it does seem as if the evidence on the ground shows this. But as I say, that there's been the arguments around this. I think that is what is the most difficult to grapple with. And even here in South Africa, we get the sense that former President Mbeki, who very recently received Joseph Kabila, the former leader of the DRC, he has a bit of a different reading to the situation than others, perhaps, in SADC and so on. If you want, I can just quickly tell you why this animosity between South Africa and Rwanda, because I think it did surprise a lot of people. We saw this very public spat, which was very unusual in diplomacy. It really goes back a long way. With the assassination of the former Rwandan general, Patrick Karegeya, here in Sandton. There's a very interesting book written about this assassination called Do Not Disturb, which is, the thing that you hang on the hotel door, because when the people at the Michelangelo finally, saw that for 3 days, or I can't remember the story, that the Do Not Disturb sign was still up. They went to check. So this former general who turned against Paul Kagame was assassinated, it formed. So the allegation was that it was by Rwandan forces. In fact, after that assassination, some officials from the Rwandan embassy here in Pretoria was expelled from the country. So South Africa seemed to have some credible evidence that it was Patrick Karegeya, but then there is another guy, General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was also the object of assassination attempts. I mean, it sounds like just criminal activity or isolated events. Why should one country be, have such animosity with another one because of that? But it is true that I think, so there were those incidents were really very, very serious and led to this diplomatic spat with Rwanda. And then a couple of things that we've been following over the years. President Paul Kagame has a certain approach to how he sees his country and diplomacy, I would say. Like, I work on the African Union, and you very often saw President Kagame standing up, almost lecturing to other heads of state, which I didn't appreciate. Rwanda is a tiny, tiny country, that obviously has a very troubled history, and Kagame is still seen by many, as the person who led Rwanda out of the 1994 genocide, which is true. But in terms of democratic and human rights norms, Rwanda is always criticized for that. President Paul Kagame has won election after election with over 90% of the votes. So continentally, I would say he is a controversial figure, because many Africans, say, wow, Kigali is the cleanest city in Africa. Very, very recently, like a few weeks ago, Rwanda had AI summit. Lots of officials were there, even South Africa's a new commissioner at the African Union was there to talk about infrastructure. So health issues like producing vaccines and so on. Rwanda is being seen as a model country on certain aspects. But when it comes to democracy and when it comes to this military security interventions, I think its reputation took a big knock. So South Africa, that issue was very unfortunate. But of course, at the time when that spat happened, our troops were actually under siege. They still are, unable to leave the country. In Goma, surrounded by M23, fighters and Rwandans. I mean, that is the accusation, as I say, that if Rwanda wanted to, and I mean, it did cooperate after that. It did actually allow the deceased and the injured, those 14 you referred to actually go through Rwanda to Kampala and Entebbe and then fly out. So it was a very, very difficult moment between Rwanda and South Africa, but it has a long history.
I wanted to just delve in there because for someone looking at this completely new to the situation, they're asking themselves, what specifically South Africa's inherent role in this conflict? Are we a guarantor of peace should there be a conversation between the government of President, I forgot the president of Congo just now.
Sure, Tshisekedi.
President Tshisekedi, and the leaders of the M23 and Paul Kagame. Because the conversation here that many South Africans are trying to wrap their head around is, we are in the most southern tip of Africa. This is a conflict that is completely isolated and devout from us. It's happening in East Africa. Many of these people aren't direct migrants to our country. It isn't a strategic national security priority for South Africa. We understand the argument that continental peace is important, but if South Africa lacks the capacity, what is our value as a guarantor to be present there on the ground? Obviously, we're there also in a SADC capacity, but within that, we understand that we are doing the majority of the heavy lifting in that capacity. So to a South African looking at this and they're saying, well, we don't even think, if we were there, we have a valuable role to play. Why is it still important that we engage in this forum as South Africa strategically?
Yes, that's a very good question. But I think we should also separate the military intervention to the diplomatic business side of it, The military intervention of SADC this time around, as I said, in 2023, in my mind, and many, many people, politicians here in South Africa, even within our own government, had said in private, what are we doing it? What is this military deployment? There's no peace to keep, So really to say we are peacekeepers was not I mean, it was not true. So it was not, an uncontroversial decision. And really, it came, I think because we tried to follow what happened, who made this decision, how did South Africa almost get drawn into this? Because first of all, our army is not up to it. We were still busy in Mozambique with those troops there they only fully withdrew in July 2024. So, we had troops there. We withdrew from Darfur where we had troops. Now we are, a struggling, underfunded military that everybody knows about, and I think many people discovered after. We don't even have military planes to airlift these people out and so on. So that military side, I think, I think there's almost consensus. We shouldn't have been there because we couldn't. There was no peace to keep, and now we're trying to get our soldiers out. And now going forward, we can't actually act as a guarantor. You're right. Now there's new peace deal, which we can talk about. But I'm sorry, we were defeated there. We're surrounded. We're trying to get our troops out. So even SADC, you can see from the last peace statement about the ceasefire, I was interested that the statement talks about the East African Community, talks about the ICGLR, which is the International Great Lakes Conference, which doesn't include South Africa. So in any case, I don't think we now at this point can be officially a guarantor, but we are a guarantor. People would be surprised at like South Sudan, for example. We are one of the guarantors of the South Sudan peace agreement. Why? Because, if we look a bit at like the dismantling of America's soft power in the world, you can make that comparison with South Africa has a lot of soft power on the African continent. And if you're a business person, you're now going in to make a deal in South Sudan or in the DRC or even in, Senegal or something. You come as South Africa, you have that soft power. Your ambassador is there with his big team. Soft power is something that's beneficial to all of us. So I know many South Africans think, what are we doing there? As you say, if it's far away, it's an intractable conflict. It's going on since decades. So, but all in all, it's every president's prerogative, and it's our decision whether we want to engage in foreign policy or not. But for example, our role in the ICJ, the conflict, the Israel-Palestine court case at the International Court of Justice, that was a fantastic show of soft power around the world. And now Zelensky's visit this week, it is beneficial, maybe not like immediately, but now if you're, I think Vodacom has now withdrawn, but let's say you're MultiChoice or ShopRite or Standard Bank, all these companies that do business in Africa, they want to do business in the DRC. People are like saying, what, you guys, you were, you don't even have an army. I'm not saying that, business is business, but soft power is our influence, and we know that South Africa's, one of our main business, investments go to, well, first of all, Southern Africa, but then also further afield, Nigeria, MTN and so on. So that's, in a nutshell, I think the military, and I don't even know whether going forward we are even able as South Africa to deploy troops. We'll have to really think about it very hard, because I was listening to the debate in a parliamentary committee where the Minister Angie Motshekga and the generals were really, really attacked by all the EFF and everybody else were giving them a very hard time, saying, how can you put our soldiers in such a predicament? So we still can, as South Africa, be a diplomatic force on the African continent. And as I say, I see it. I'm in Addis Ababa a lot. I can see South Africa comes to a debate about something with a lot of capacity and knowledge and, power really, and can influence decisions. But we can't back that up with the army. We actually can't. But then again, who can on the African continent? That's another question. We can't. It's actually only the non-African states that come in with funding and military support and so on.
It's very interesting what you're raising, because it's sort of a theme that I've picked up with South Africa, because, even though we're not of the generation that would remember this, but the arms deal debacle coming out of the need for South Africa to increase its military capacity, because I think it started first when President Mandela sent one of our warships to meet Mobutu Sese Seko at the time and Josette Kabila during our first engagement officially in the Congo, and the need that came there out of to match our soft diplomatic capacity with a military force. But I think for people that are looking at this, the picture you paint is very true, because the first time we tried to do this with the military review did not go well. We got the equipment, but the equipment was at times incomplete, and when it was incomplete, we couldn't really deploy sufficiently. So I'm just really saying this to summarize to people that it's strategically important for business interests, also for South Africa, that there is an inherent economic tie that is there for us, a market to be grown and developed, which is mutually beneficial for South African markets and Congolese markets as well.
The question I do want to ask, and particularly interesting for where this conflict has taken place and the timeline and where it's taken place. I want to speak about American funding USAID, but that's a separate conversation. But I think my first question is, what do you think about the shift to hard power on the global front? So the idea that America is trying to ensure everyone use their military power, and that being something that's kind of showing itself in Africa. We're seeing a lot of the militias come out again. We're seeing a lot of the military presence grow. Within West Africa, there's been that coup belt, and we've seen quite a lot of that. South Africa being the diplomatic actor that it is, firstly, there's a big question around the ICJ case and whether that still makes us non-aligned. Do we still have the capacity to stand in the middle? But secondly, the question is, what then is South Africa's value to the continent as a whole, particularly in the soft power moment? We've seen our presence on the AU. We've seen ourselves advocating for a UN Security Council seat. We're seeing the presence of trying to grow South Africa diplomatically. But now we've also got the United States, which vehemently doesn't want to operate with South Africa. And there's a question around whether or not South Africa is being sidelined, particularly with the joint statement that's come out recently. And if South Africa doesn't have the military power, what is its value add to everyone on the continent? Because at times it does feel like we're speaking from a very moral standpoint, but we're unable to actualize what we're saying to people and able to ensure that our stance and position is something that's of value.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right that the militarization of politics is what we are seeing around the world, Europeans, the US, and then the resurgence of some of these groups. We even think, coming back to the DRC, that the context in which these groups deployed, and in Rwanda's backing, which, I mean, as you rightly said, is controversial, but would President Paul Kagame have taken this very controversial step that he knew somehow very unpopular, but maybe good economically for his country, if Donald Trump had not been in power? Because this happened just after Trump. No rules anymore, respecting of sovereignty and so on. So the context is, it is true. So what is South Africa's value then? We must also remember that wars and militarization have completely changed in nature. So what we see, for example, in Sudan and other places is that it really depends on how many drones you have, not how many soldiers you have on the ground. So things have completely changed. And, I was looking at the statement after Zelensky's visit now. there is mention of South Africa. It's not my focus, so I might get it wrong, but South Africa buying some drone technology, getting drone technology from Ukraine, which is a producer of drones. And I was thinking to ask one of our military experts to ask, is South Africa going to be producing drones? Because we know Denel was site capture, and so we used to actually be a big producer of military hardware, and we do have a couple of niche, I think, attack helicopters, which only South Africa makes and that we sell to other countries or try to sell. So, sure, we don't have that hard power. It has now shown in the DRC that we don't have it. We also, the military intervention in Mozambique had mixed results.
Yeah.
But because the nature of warfare has now changed, I'm asking the question, if South Africa, let's say, came in and at a massive scale somehow produced drones and sent it to other countries, almost as a deterrent, even in this DRC war, Rwanda has drones and the M23 has drones, and a lot of people are saying that made a massive difference, and how it turned out. So we need to unpack that idea of military might in a new era where, militarization, I mean, maybe it's a bit in the future. I think the Ukraine war and so on, they still rely on conventional warfare. But in Africa, we see Iranian drones, Turkish drones, in places like Sudan, it makes a huge difference at, who's winning or losing, how many drones you have.
But I wanted to ask, do we then run the risk of drone warfare, drone technology in this specific sense, becoming like old Soviet-era weapons that used to circulate across the continent? Not just Soviet-era, but World War II-era weapons that were just churned out to help feed the cycles of violence that we saw predominantly around the 60s, quelling out in the 70s. And because my concern also is, where strategically should, if an audience member here was in the position to influence a legislator or influence someone that could have an impact on this, where specifically should we be as South Africa trying to gear ourselves? Where should the continent strategically be trying to gear itself? Because I fear us going that route, and then it becomes like those recycled weapons that then facilitate an endless cycle of violence. And drone technology is a lot harder to not so much track, but control as compared to weapons, because once you've seized the weapons, you've dismantled it, it's done. They cannot reproduce these guns, but drone technology is easily reproducible if you get the right schematics for that specific piece of technology. I'm just asking myself, because we're heading into a more, not just politically polarized setting, but the extremities to which countries are now fighting proxy wars, but on a much larger scale, is increasing. In a sense, the Russia-Ukraine conflict is also a way of China testing the parameters of how far America and the West is willing to go should it decide to take Taiwan. There are multiple other conflicts that also stemming out of what's happening now with Gaza, and the ICJ case will determine the posture of countries such as India, Pakistan. We're seeing a little dust-up happening there, which I encourage people to keep their eyes on, because it's very concerning, two nuclear powers choosing to test each other off. Strategically for Africa, should we be gearing ourselves more towards building up our capacity militarily, or should we be investing more in saying we should be getting more diplomatic avenues opened now more than ever, when it seems that America's soft power is receding from the international stage? Europe seems less and less likely to step in because they're dealing with their own conflict with Russia and Ukraine. The Middle East has its own dust-up happening with what's going on in Gaza. Africa strategically right now, is this our time to rearm, or is this our time to get our diplomats field in places everywhere now?
Yeah, I think you answered your own question. Definitely. Ideally, we should be much more ambitious when it comes to peacemaking. Our diplomats, are doing a very good job. I think in terms of South Africa, in terms of the limits, that they also have the constraints, dealing with other countries diplomatically, South Africa does play a role in that sense. But the African Union should be more ambitious, our SADCs, all the regional economic communities, the REX, ECOWAS, that's another issue, it's under threat, and then the EAC and so on. African diplomacy definitely needs to be more ambitious, because we do have the diplomats, but it's almost as if, when something happens, we tend to sort of maybe are too careful. It's not an easy thing. 54 countries of the African Union, and you have vastly different regions with different histories, different levels of economic development and so on, and to build consensus and say, okay, this is where we're moving to is not easy, but with good leadership, you actually can do it. So you're right. I mean, the militarization is really something Africa should try and prevent. And I mean, you mentioned the Cold War arming and so on. I think that we are still suffering so much from the fallout of that. I mean, I was listening this morning to some of the inhabitants there of Goma saying they can't go out to their fields or of that region because there are landmines. I mean, landmines, I mean, that's that should be something that no one, deploys or produces and so on. So for decades and decades, those arms that were flooding the continent, were still being used. So, but then at the same time, as we've said, you have soft power, but if you don't have any hard power, if you don't have any backup, it can, at the end of the day, it is sort of your how can I say, the backup, your big power capacity. If we could use that in peacekeeping missions, have a peace deal, implement it, and then okay, you have two warring parties. Who's going to keep them apart? Or even, what we have, South Africa has been involved a lot, is these verification missions. So in Ethiopia, for example, there's a peace deal with the Tigray region. There was that terrible war a few years ago. So South Africa is part of the monitoring and verification mission that was set up after the peace deal in 2022, November. So, I mean, it's also underfunded and, not visible enough and so on. But they basically go and then check whether these armies are, sticking to the deal. And these are military people who do that. So after, in 2006, but also in 2013, SADC was one of the guarantors of the deal at the time to get the M23 to withdraw. So there was also a verification mission, but these are military, and they're peace missions. So you do need a military. You do need actually a good military if you want to do a certain amount of things, not to make war, but to kind of stop it.
Yeah.
But we'll have to see where this all goes in terms of the actual military hardware situation.
The question I do want to ask is, if you look at the African Union's history, or particularly when it was the OAU, there was a very big gripe around the fact that the African leaders couldn't agree on what democratic system was going to lead them, or if democracy was going to be important. There was a lot of authoritarian leadership that dominated within its region. And the diplomacy, as a result, died because there was a disagreement on what principles were forwarding us. We see the transition into the AU, and we see things like non-intervention. We see the complaints around the AU potentially not doing as much as it should in terms of the DRC, and particularly in Sudan and in other areas where conflict tends to be pretty major. Particularly around this point of diplomacy, because I think it's interesting that it's been separated from military prowess. The two questions I would ask firstly is, one, in terms of the AU, how does it get better at doing its job? Because when people are critiquing its failures, I'm like, yes, you can critique openly, but you're not necessarily identifying why it's failing. But secondly, are we seeing a resurgence of what happened historically? Because we're seeing a lot of these countries being prided on the fact that they're authoritarian, prided on the fact that they're effective, they're good governance. But we know there's a great deal of human rights violations that are happening. We know there's a great deal of a limit of expression, a limit of media. And once again, we have these African leaders all coming together to claim that we care for the continent, we care for the peace, we care for the people, but we don't agree on what system that's going to be in terms of moving us forward. So particularly between a South Africa and a Rwanda, you see that principle fight quite drastically. Within the DRC, you also see that internally there's disagreements about what's the way forward for the country. Collectively, it seems like there isn't an agreement for where Africa is heading. On one end, it's to say that Africa is saying that democracy no longer works, is no longer for us, which I think is a very concerning point for Africa. But on the other end, there's people who are saying that effective governance is the most important thing. We've dealt with the poor lives, we've dealt with poor basic services, we've dealt with a great deal of conflict that's hindered our ability to engage our economy. So we just need effective leaders, and particularly where the AU is centered, being the centralization hub of bringing these leaders together. Why aren't we seeing the collaboration, and what's the critique for that? But also then, what do we make of this new wave of anti-democracy that's dominating the AU and dominating the continent as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that the African Union itself grapples with a lot, you know. I mean, those are also excellent questions. So I think when, the African Union was created in 2002 specifically on the basis of rejecting the idea of non-intervention, basing itself on non-indifference. So non-indifference, we are not, we do, the Article 4H of the Protocol of the Peace and Security Council says that in grave circumstances, the African Union can intervene to save lives, because this was also on the back of what happened in Rwanda and so on. So the African Union, as it was conceived initially, was precisely, as you say, to go against that argument or that criticism that these are just a bunch of authoritarian leaders that get together twice a year and, ineffectual. In fact, they're just helping one another stay in power, Are we seeing this a backsliding towards, now accepting authoritarian regimes? And I think the African Union is a bit at a crossroads, and there are many debates in Addis Ababa around this. Because, as you know, so the Lome Convention of 2000 outlaws military coups on the African continent. If there's a military coup, you get suspended from the organization. And that has been one of the principles the African Union has really stuck to, and has been applauded for that by NGOs and human rights and individuals on the African continent. And now, currently, there are 6 countries suspended from the African Union due to this. So Guinea, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Sudan, and Gabon. Gabon just had elections. And the question now of the African Union Peace and Security Council is to say, do we kind of accept Gabon because... okay, it hasn't really played by the rules, because the rules say that you're not allowed, if you perpetrated a coup, you're not allowed to stand for elections.
Very tricky wording.
So it means, so the general there who perpetrated the coup, Aulinkin Gema, he says no, but I have now taken off my military uniform. I'm now a civilian leader. This is someone else now. I am a Democrat, and so I need to be accepted. And I mean, there's a huge debate within Gabon, within the African Union. What do we do? Do we accept them in? Because the situation, it's almost an existential question now for the African Union, because how do you move forward with 6 countries suspended from the AU? Regional integration, and there are so many implications of this. Especially now, you have the Alliance of Sahel states. They are undermining ECOWAS, the African Union, and so on. So my feeling is, and I was there a week ago, is from the discussion, it sounds like, Gabon might be accepted back into the African Union. Just like Chad was not suspended from the African Union. I mean, like, you can always get around some of these rules. But what does it mean going forward? Does it mean that if Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso is very popular, if he now says, oh, let's have an election, I'm taking off this uniform, can we be allowed back in? What should we then say? Okay, we're going to change the Lomé Convention. For the credibility of the African Union, it is important, but there's also a question of African integration. Can we keep the continent together? Should we not be a bit more pragmatic and realistic and say, well, this is what people in Burkina Faso want? That is also a debate, because how do you know what people really want if there aren't any elections? Is it just people on social media who've been, I don't know, pro-Russian propaganda or whatever? But and obviously now you have 15 members of the Peace and Security Council. They're the ones who ultimately decide. And you have countries like Algeria and Ethiopia, and that's another struggling country. But, you have Eswatini, and South Africa was until very recently on the PSC, and we're hoping it will come back soon. But yeah, it is, I think it's a crucial moment for the African Union, because I think people, just to end off on that score, people expect a lot from the African Union, and it should. It's our only continental organization, and it has a proud history. But it's ultimately, the commission in Addis Ababa is very small. It has a small staff. It has a budget of $600 million, which is really nothing, I mean, it's what I think is spent in a month in defending Ukraine or whatever. So that small team, and now we've had elections in February. There's a new chairperson of the commission. There's a new team that hopefully, and I see there's a lot of expectation that he's now going to reset, and we as Crisis Group also wrote about that. But ultimately, the commission in Addis Ababa needs to have more powers that the member states give them, because the European Union, for example, in Brussels, they can go ahead and make statements and do things because the states have ceded sovereignty. It's a truly, supranational organization. The African Union is intergovernmental. No one, if no one needs to listen to the African Union, ultimately, but the African Union does have soft power. Yeah. It has convening power. It has credibility. If the African Union steps up now and says, we are leading the peace process in Sudan. Come on, we are organizing this in Addis Ababa, and we have everyone behind us. It has a greater chance of success. I mean, having said that, initially we had the US and Saudi Arabia and so on getting involved, but that's where the African Union needs to be more ambitious. Work behind the scenes. How did Qatar manage to do this peace deal? By having, sending planes. The African Union doesn't have a plane, a private jet to say, Kagame, Tshisekedi, come to Doha, luxury hotel, whining and I don't know, I wasn't there, so I'm just imagining it, But they have more means, but they're more ambitious also. Yeah. I think we should be more ambitious because the time is right. Africa's on its own, as you said earlier. No one, not the Americans or anybody's going to bail us out. Even if so what happened, for example, the Pretoria Agreement to end the war in Tigray, that was precisely almost that happened. The Americans sent a plane to Tigray to bring the leaders. and the Ethiopian government brought them to Pretoria. And there, I think the Americans were very smart, stayed behind the scenes. You know, you had this very continental panel, including South Africa. South Africa has got wonderful facilities and so on, you know, and hosted the talks, signed an agreement which no one thought was going to happen. But that is how you do it, you know. And that agreement, I mean, okay, it's very problematic and so on, but it has stuck since November 2022. So why can't we? I mean, we're happy for peace. We're happy whoever has peace. But I think it's got more credibility, and it probably has more staying power if it's done on the African continent.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think citizens, if I see on social media, you know, how people are reacting to the DRC deal, I think citizens would welcome a more ambitious African Union.
I do want to ask a question around legitimacy, because I think that's becoming an interesting question around the world, particularly with the UN, particularly with the AU, particularly with America just as an actor. It seems like around the world, countries are becoming illegitimate choices. So it's South Africa being in partnership with Russia, but also supporting an ICJ case. It's the United States and just their long history of moral irregularities. It seems like around the world, we're starting to lose the faith in institutions that were meant to promote peace, that were meant to promote democracy, that were meant to promote human rights. And I guess the question is, what does peace look like to the AU? What's the conversation in there internally? Because I guess on one end, some people do believe peace is no conflict, and on the other end, peace is a world where development's occurring. Because we've seen instances where there hasn't been no conflict, and then conflict is resurged. So I do want to ask a question there, because I think the interesting thing is that you then hear the denouncement of Western institutions, especially within places such as West Africa. It must become increasingly harder for then a institution like the UN to step in and say, we want to help you, because there's an almost belief of you come from the West, you are illegitimate. And there's a question around how much we discredit the amount of aid that exists from the West. And I think that particularly has been highlighted with USAID. When they cut that, all the African leaders were kind of like, okay, now it's serious. Now we're on our own. And that was an interesting moment, because it felt like on the continent as a whole, there was an anti-West movement where people were saying, we want to do away with the Americans. We want to do away with the French. We want to kind of get our independence back, choose our own solutions. The idea of African solutions for African people, that rootedness in let's be the ones to take control of our issues. But there's also this massive financial question, as you've mentioned and as you've pointed out too. What is the importance of USAID in terms of it being pulled away? Because I know it's had quite a degree of impact in terms of the DRC, in terms of people having access to food, people having access to medication and stuff. But on a more macro scale, what is the conversation between the UN and the USA, and particularly how those things are interacting? Because we see them as a separate entity, but the US has quite a great deal of influence in terms of the Security Council, in terms of just voting power and diplomacy in that space. That also seems to be influencing quite significantly what's happening on the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're referring to is actually the crisis of multilateralism. You know, basically, multilateralism is the idea that collectively, you know, we can do better than individually. And also, as you say, it's a war of brands. I mean, the American brand is got such a huge hit, and very difficult, you know, to get back to that. And obviously the UN, so just on your last question, I mean, the US plays a big role, member of the UN Security Council, but also finances more than 25% of all UN peacekeeping operations.
Jeez.
You know, and then things like the World Food Program. So USAID, which is an American, you know, aid, one of the biggest, well, I guess the biggest in the world, aid development agency, has now cut back almost completely. The impact of that is huge, and I think it's also a wake-up call to a lot of people to say, wow, we have been, you know, so reliant for antiretrovirals, for all these projects, for the aiding the displaced, and the impact is immense. Millions of people are being affected, really, on the African continent. It's a wake-up call, but, African countries, many are at war, many have got a very small tax base. I mean, South Africa, we are lucky that we can, SARS can actually rely on, 20% of the population who receives a salary, or 25%. I mean, in many countries, they are solely dependent, and if they do have that, extraction, minerals like the DRC, and then it's just the elite that benefits from it. But countries who don't have any resources and who have subsistence farming and, people in the informal sector who don't pay tax, they have no resources, to then, when there's war, to feed people in a refugee camp. So you do need that. And the conversation also globally and in the African Union is to say, who's going to step in? And I must say the Gulf states, your UAEs, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, people are surprised to know that the UAE is the biggest investor on the African continent, more than China today.
Jeez.
The Gulf states, what they are doing in terms of peacemaking, we've now heard about Qatar, but Turkey, recently made a very important peace deal between Ethiopia and Somalia. They are the new actors. They've got lots of money, small populations. They also want to be seen to be doing
humanitarian
things. We haven't seen it. So the downside is they're not multilateralists. They don't really, they don't fund the African Union mission in Somalia. They are very bilateral. That's almost their culture. It's also not, they don't have that culture of democratic doing things in consensus.
Is it also a function of them having been burnt by multilateral systems and forums in the past?
It could be, it could be. And these are all fairly new states, but we are hoping that ultimately because we need a solution tomorrow to feed people. So, that is one end of what you're saying. The other thing is, the credibility of the UN, the credibility of the African Union. Behind the scenes, things are still moving forward. The UN is a massive organization with thousands of people, and they do fantastic work in many, many places. As I say, we've been dealing with South Sudan and so on. But I think there's a lot of anxiety now within the UN. What's going to happen? We desperately need reform of the UN Security Council because, Russia and the US cannot agree, and so on. And then you see minilaterals, so the G20, which we are now chairing this year, which is an economic forum, but South Africa is really trying to, first of all, make it more Pan-African, including, the rest of the continent. Also looking a little bit at governance and security, tying that in. And then you have the G7, of course, the richest countries, you have BRICS. So we'll see merging other forms of multilateralism. Hopefully, that can be beneficial because these big institutions like the UN, like the AU, the EU, I think, has got a new lease on life. But still, ordinary citizens in Europe, almost gave up on the EU at one point. So you do... I think there's this multipolar situation at the moment, people are always in all these debates quoting Gramsci, or I don't know who said the old, out with the old, but the new is not yet born. So we don't know. We are in a interesting, very uncertain phase where we now have to invent. And we can, as the African continent, we can invent. You guys are the new generation. You can invent new things, and hopefully, so that we don't have a Cold War situation, so that we don't have the African Union and the African continent being victims of big power competition, other people deciding for Africa, so that, these shore up the institutions, basically.
I wanted to ask, and cognizant of time as well, possibly my last question. What then becomes the future of the non-aligned movement? Because I think we saw specifically with South Africa in respect to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but more specifically, in a very strange symptom coming through with the ICJ case, certain elements out of the United States government saying, well, you took a position that they view vehemently against Israel, therefore you are an enemy of the United States because you are an enemy of the United States' friends. Specifically, Africa's benefited from, certain African states have benefited from adopting the non-aligned movement position because it allows them to beneficiate from the relationship in the globalist trade, the global economy, during vast expansive period of globalism that hit us 90s, 2000s, and all into the mid-2010s. Does this new polarization of politics, not just on the continent but in the world, then mean that a position of non-aligned countries becomes more untenable, that it's no longer a position of benefit, but it now becomes a trickier position in that by siding with no one or by choosing not to take a position, you are immediately put into the position of an opponent?
That's a really interesting question. I think South African diplomats grappled with that because initially, remember the backlash when South Africa didn't want to, criticize Russia for invading Ukraine at the UN, and I mean it lasted for years, and the criticism from the US, from the EU, and so on. But South Africa just said, we are non-aligned. There is a non-aligned movement, which, the non-aligned organization, I think, is pretty much been sidelined or doesn't exist. It's not a very strong organization. I mean, be diplomatic. But and now, South Africa just received Zelensky, is being seen as a force for good, precisely because, we speak to both sides. But that is a very tricky one, to pull off, I think, as you say, with Israel and with the ICJ case. That's almost more difficult in a way, but still, South Africa has really gotten a lot of praise for its stance. I think as South Africa, you can probably pull it off if the stars align in your favor. But if you are a small country, in Africa that doesn't have support of your neighbors and you're trying to do something like that, I'm not sure, So I guess, again, coming back to multilateralism, if the African continent wants to take a non-aligned position, it will really have to stand together. Otherwise, you're so vulnerable, as you rightly pointed out, to, now being a victim of either side that you choose to align with. I mean, we don't know those Sahel states, they've now aligned with Russia. They're still battling terribly the jihadist threats. The insecurity there has really not improved since they've gotten Russian support. So ideally, to be able to secure, to ensure your own security, your own economic development, and then rely on your neighbors rather than, those further away.
My question in closing would be, viewing this from the South African government standpoint, and particularly at this moment with the withdrawals, where the country is, how the world has responded, because I think there's been quite a development from the January when Trump entered versus where we are now. What's the best outlook for South Africa? What is our best outcome, particularly when it comes to the DRC, but also particularly when it comes to the continent as a whole? We attest quite significantly to it being peace without necessarily defining what that peace looks like. But there's something to be said about there's an active effort that's being made, and there's a conscious IR decision or influence or strategy that's being taken that's probably not being spoken about on a mass scale in South Africa. So when we do look at this conflict, when people are trying to evaluate whether or not it's working out or it isn't working out, I mean, to some extent, we've already seen it as a failure. But the question moving forward is, what is the outcome for South Africa? What are we looking for? How do we get out of this? And how do we look back at it and say we were good contributors rather than people who harmed the situation and led to more victims? And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, South Africa does need to repair its image, its sort of military image due to what happened. But the best outcome would be, in this moment, for us to use our soft power, diplomatic power, invent new strategies, new conventions, new structures within, let's say, the African Union. So we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and Nkadimeng is South African. He's leading it. He's running the secretariat in Ghana. We now have a commissioner for infrastructure who was just elected on the African Union Commission. So the best outcome for South Africa would be, to champion those structures which, we believe in and can make a difference, because South Africa's approach has often been, look at economic development, then you won't have wars because you would have stability. And so, to continue championing those, but also inventing new structures, new formats, new alliances, getting its relations with Nigeria and the big powers back, so that you have that engine of moving the continent forward. We can't do this alone, but we also need the other big players with us. I think, we really, really have a lot going for us. Perhaps also improving a bit the SANDF ability to respond. But, in the meantime, because we don't have funds for that initially, I suppose, move forward with those other initiatives, trade deals, and working with other big powers on the African continent.
Well, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you for giving us our time and your knowledge. This has been extremely informative. Yes. I'm going to go back and do a lot of reading. To everyone else, if you've made it this far, as always, we hope you've enjoyed Born Free, and we hope you're enjoying the conversation. So, yeah, thank you.